When was the last time you made something beautiful with your own two hands? Today we're joined by our contributor, William Field, who has written a wonderful article for us about the importance of working a craft. Before we move into the interview, just a reminder that our March issue of Bedrock is out now, and you can still pick up a copy by subscribing on our website before June the 15th. So as long as you subscribe before June the 15th, you'll get a copy of this sent straight to your door. So, William, welcome very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you, Alex.
Well, should we just start with your background? Who are you? How did you get into working on various different crafts and things?
Absolutely, certainly, yes. So my name is William Field. My background really, insofar as my work is really all in science. I got a science degree at uni, and my day job is in the pharmaceutical industry, in pharmaceutical advertising. But hopefully we won't dwell on that too much today, and we'll talk much more about my about my hobbies. The primary one being candle making, which I got into originally, I think about 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, when I took a day trip with my wife into the Cotswolds, and I think we were in Bourton-on-the-Water, and they have a really nice candle shop there. And we went in to have a look round to see what they had. I think we just moved. We just got married, I think, and we moved into our first house together. So we're looking for some nice candles to burn. And I saw through a kind of open door into a back room a gentleman making candles. I'd never seen them being made before. I think perhaps I'd seen them being made in molds, but he was dipping them. So he had this sort of unusual looking frame with long wicks pulled taut on it, and he was dipping it into this large tube and pulling them out, and then cutting them and hanging them on these racks. And I was sort of fascinated by the process of it all. And I thought, well, it doesn't look that hard. How hard can it be? And so I'm ashamed to say I didn't buy anything in the shop at all. And we went home and gave it a go ourselves using beeswax. We tried it on the stovetop in our kitchen in an old empty metal coffee can, and found that it wasn't terribly hard. The initial, I seem to remember the initial products weren't fantastic, but we managed it. We managed to make something, and then ever since then, it's been a kind of long trajectory of trying to hone and perfect this craft and develop it and turn it into a small business as well. So that really has been the trajectory ever since.
Wonderful, yeah, and you have a very, in my opinion, a very successful business. I often buy from Flax and Wax if anybody's interested. Yeah, and I think in your article, you also go into a lot of detail about why you think it's very important for us to have all of these crafts. One of the things I found particularly interesting, reflecting on it from such a personal point of view, was that you also looked at the historical development of what most people did historically and now do for their daily work, and how that's changed over time. Could you tell us a bit about that? Yes,
absolutely. So I mean, really, this craft, this hobby has had a great deal to teach me. You know, the ideas that I have and that I sort of elaborated in that article are things that have, you might say, sort of revealed to me to be true by the practice of this craft. So, going back to the historical kind of standpoint, I mean, going all the way back, when we think about work, the kind of work that people did, you know, for a very, very long time, this work is really just it's a labour for the bare necessities of life, right? For shelter, for food, and it's all by the sweat of your brow, all by the sweat of your brow. You know, yes, you might have rents to pay and such like, but a great deal of your labour is with your own two hands to sustain yourself. And now that was really quite a constant thing for a very large part of human history. And it's only very recently that we've kind of moved away from this labour with our hands and more towards a kind of, you know, a kind of labour that involves the mind and technology, and that we use where we're quite far removed from kind of tools and actual manual work, and we work kind of technological jobs for a salary. So in that piece, I was looking to kind of unpack and explore the transition from the modern forms of work. Explore the transitions from these older forms of work that were very stable for a long time to this very recent transition into the modern forms of work, and discuss what we maybe have lost along the way and need to recultivate.
And I love the phrase that you used in your article of people nowadays working by the sweat of their fingers instead of by the sweat of their brow. That we're
Quite
just
so.
sitting
Yeah, quite so.
And yes, I think it's a very insightful kind of contrast to look at what did most people's daily work look like, say 300, 400 years ago compared to now. Another contrast you sort of drew was this idea of labourers and artisans versus workers and technicians as like the primary means of work. How do you think we can regain some of what you think was lost?
Well, that's a very good question, and when I was considering it, I did think that I wanted to write for what I considered to, most people reading the article, I thought, that most people reading this probably will have the kind of job that I have. It's a broadly sort of, they call them laptop jobs, don't they? Slightly derogatory kind of term, but it's some kind of a laptop job that maybe you commute to, maybe you work from home. I'm aware that there are people out there who still do work by the sweat of their brow, so to speak. Farmers and such like. But even among agricultural workers, a lot of farmers have been rather removed from the land with the advent of mechanization and everything like that. So I wanted to write for what I thought sort of most people, where most people would be coming from. And I think it's true that in the modern day, it is very difficult for most people to just give up their day job and embrace some kind of craft and become, like a master craftsman, like a furniture maker or something like that. And the solution, or part of the solution that I proposed, was embracing kind of craft as a hobby. It doesn't need to be something where you start a business right away, but if you at least cultivate a hobby that involves this kind of craft, then you've got a really good starting point to go from. Anyone can do that. We've all got spare time, no matter how busy we might think we are. We've all got spare time to allot to this kind of thing, to a craft.
Yes, absolutely, and it's one of the more rewarding hobbies you can have, I suppose, if you have something to show for it at the end. If you're not just spending time whiling away by reading or hiking, excellent hobbies in themselves, but at the end of it, you actually have a thing that you can keep in your house or give to a friend. Yes,
well, I think it's my view that hobbies should be productive, and they can be productive in different ways. You might think that, well, just reading books, well, that's not very productive, but it can be. If you read the right books and you educate yourself, you might end up writing an article for a certain excellent publication. So that can be productive. There's many different ways that hobbies can be productive. It doesn't necessarily need to result in the production of a material thing, although that is obviously a much more obvious, concrete way of going about it. But that's certainly my view, is that hobbies should be productive.
Wonderful, yeah. And you touched on this just now when you talked about farming and mechanization, and you also touched on this in your article. But one of the things you think is, if I understood you correctly, you think is very important about crafts is this idea of knowing your tools well. That nowadays the tools that we use for our work we don't really understand, whereas historically we did. Could you go into more detail about that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, no, that's really, as I believe it was Bedrock pointed out, I forget in which one of his works, but he pointed out in his study of kind of historical economics and the kind of jobs that people did, that for a very long time most people kind of owned the means of production, so to speak. They owned their own tools, they owned the tools of their labour, even if they didn't necessarily own the land that they were working. They certainly owned the tools of their labour. and usually they were very high quality and passed down generation to generation. And people, so not only did they own them, they were their property, but they also really understood them. Whereas, I was contrasting that nowadays with, certainly the kind of technology that I use in my job. I have a rudimentary understanding of how to make it work to do the things I need it to do, but beyond that, it might as well be a black box full of magic, I think, as I said in the article. And to me, this kind of estrangement from our tools is not a particularly good thing. It's kind of perverse that you would do a job where you're given a laptop on day one and you just sort of tap away at it and give it back when you leave the job and whatever. When historically, a craftsman had this kind of very close relationship with his tools. Often he would make his own tools, and that's interestingly in my hobby. That's where I am at the moment. It's actually quite difficult to get a hold of good candle making equipment in Britain. A lot of what I need I have to import, but I'm at the stage now where I know these tools so well. I know exactly what I need them to do, that I'm starting to figure out how to make some of these things myself. And this really puts you in touch with your work in a way that's sort of almost indescribable if you haven't experienced it before. You are in such a close relationship with your work that it's like I say, it almost eludes description. But this is something that we've gone so far away from in the modern day and with modern work. Hence why I think we need to start recultivating this, even if it's just initially in the kind of hobby sphere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. Of course, there are people who know how a computer works, but there must be such a tiny proportion of the people who end up using computers for their job, as just one example.
Well, yes, but look at the trajectory of where we've been going with that. My parents actually, I would say they know how to operate a computer better than I did, and probably better than my brothers and sisters do. They joke about it. They say, how are these kids so tech illiterate? They spend all their time on their phones. but there it is. There's the truth of it. They actually know how to set up servers and complicated file pathways and everything like that, because they used an earlier iteration of this technology where you had to do a lot more of it yourself. As it's progressed, we do less and less and less of it ourselves, and I wouldn't know how to do half the things that they knew how to do when they were running their business.
And nowadays with AI doing all the coding and so on, it's
exactly. So the trajectory in modern work, as far as I'm concerned, is only getting worse, really.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that I read quite recently last week was not in your article, but somewhere else, I can't remember where. This idea that people are scared of becoming experts in a very particular concrete thing, because if you're, for example, if you're making something, if you're making a table and that's your job, it's very easy to spot a badly made table, and so you really need to make sure you're good at it. Everything you're doing, you're really doing to a very high quality. If you make a mistake, that's a lot of sunk capital that you then need to sort of remake, as opposed to a lot of these office jobs where you make a mistake in a spreadsheet, that's okay, you just cut it out and copy and paste something else in instead. Do you think that's one of the reasons why this has become the trajectory, that people have moved away from riskier jobs to slightly safer ones?
It could be. That's the first time I've heard it described like that. But I could certainly believe it. I can relate. I can certainly relate in my own line of work. It's very frustrating. In my own hobby, I should clarify. It's very frustrating when you get so close to finishing a beautiful set of candles and then you muck something up and suddenly you've got to start all over again. It's this hobby of mine. Like I say, in many ways, it's far more taxing and stressful than my day job, which, like you say, is you make a mistake, it's very easy to just go in and fix it, isn't it? Whereas this, you have to be paying attention the whole time. because one little mistake and then, you're very conscious of that. The quality that it should be. You have to start all over again. But that shouldn't put people off. That's I'm not saying we should recultivate these crafts because they're just an easy, pleasant hobby that will make you feel good. They will make you feel good, but there will probably be a great deal of toil and suffering and strife along the way, where you're getting, you can't figure out why something's going wrong, and then finally you fix it. You find, I had a lot of that in the kind of earlier stages of my hobby. I still have it even today. But there's a satisfaction that results from sorting those kind of things out that make it all worth it. So it's not something to shy away from. It's something to embrace.
And you end up with something so beautiful, and you feel like you've invested so much time and effort into crafting this beautiful thing at the end of it, which I suppose you never would get from your day job if you're just doing a fairly typical white collar job.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that's very true. And of course, with crafts specifically, there is a kind of ongoing cultivation and an ongoing improvement of the craft. I mean, my own experience is, and I'm sure that other sort of craftsmen share this, is obviously that you're never quite perfectly happy with what you've made. Perhaps it's just part of my personality, but you're right, as you said a minute ago, that you know what is right and what is perfect. So you're constantly kind of trying to measure yourself up to that. But because of that, you do have this kind of ongoing refinement. You try and make it better and better and better and better, even just incrementally. And this is how we have ended up, at least in Europe, with the kind of great crafting traditions that we have. The beautiful violins of Germany or something like that. Those were made over generations and generations and generations of refinement, from father to son, getting better and better and better and better until you have these things that are so wonderfully made, so beautifully made. That kind of refinement, again and again and again, better and better and better. That is where craft leads ultimately to these wonderful things that we can make.
But I suppose another aspect of that is, it's not just whatever craft you're doing, whether you're a violin maker or a chandler or whatever it might be. It's not just that there's one final product, the platonic form of the violin that you're aiming towards as you're refining it, but you're making a number of little decisions along the way, which are making it your violin. You could have, the top 3 violin makers in the world producing marvelous works of art which are completely different, or whether it's candle making. The phrase that stuck out to me in your article was this idea of creative individuality. Could you go into more detail as to how you've experienced that creative individuality in your own craft or your own candle making?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a concept, of course, that I'm borrowing from John Ruskin, because he talks about this in various places in his writings. I seem to remember him discussing it in the context of the building of the Gothic cathedrals. That you can see the personality of the stonemasons in the individual stones, and it's that in part that gives them their beauty. It's why you couldn't just replicate a Gothic cathedral using a machine, for instance, that carves blocks all in the same way. That creative individuality not only contributes to the beauty and richness of the final product, but also, it's also this. It's also greatly enriching to the craftsman as well. A little bit of your personality goes into that thing that you're making, and so there's a great kind of satisfaction that results from that. But yes, I mean, this is. You're right. This is why we can't just take something like a Stradivarius and just say, well, we'll just plug the kind of design into a machine and just make them to order, right? That's why that wouldn't work. There is this kind of creative genius of the craftsman, and it's not just that craftsman, it's, you know, in the cases of these highly refined products, let's say like a Stradivarius, you know, it's the personality of the craftsman and of his father and of his father's father, and, you know, going all the way back through the generations. And I imagine that we probably couldn't even point to specific little details and say, well, that comes from here and that comes from there. But yes, that certainly contributes to the fineness and the beauty of these objects, is the personality of the craftsman.
Yes, yeah, certainly. You mentioned John Ruskin, and in your article you also discussed the wider arts and crafts movement along with William Morris that he was part of. Has that been a big influence on your way of viewing craft, would you say?
Yes, I would say that it has. I mean, you know, particularly the kind of anti-industrial bent, I think, was the thing that had sort of a real impact on me. I mean, all the kind of figures who were involved with that. That's certainly had an impact. I mean, I think what has been particularly profound about reading some of those authors and seeing them discuss the issues of their time is that because of when they were writing, you know, in the 19th century and other writers into the kind of earliest 20th century as well, from what I could tell, a lot of their movements and ideas are really put on pause by the wars of the 20th century, by the First and the Second World Wars. And they aren't really fully, properly picked up again after those two wars. Obviously, there's such a calamity that you know, that it sort of puts that movement and that philosophy on hold to a certain extent. And they're not picked up again, really, after that, after the Second World War. There are some kind of minor little revival movements that you see here and there. And going back to their ideas, you realise, well, you know, this hasn't got any better. This has got much, much worse. The problems that they were discussing, the problems of industrialisation, you know, we're far past industrialisation now. We're in a post-industrial world, and that has not remedied the problems they were talking about. They have become far, far, far worse. So I'm reading these writers and thinking their ideas are more profound and even more important now than they were back then. So they have this kind of urgency to them. So yeah, they've certainly been a big influence.
Right. Yes, it's always interesting. We have some William Morris print placemats at home, and it always kind of makes me chuckle a little bit, taking out these placemats and thinking these things have been mass-produced by scale on this plastic for all these many consumers who are buying them. What would these great figures think about their work being mass-produced? Do you have any thoughts on? I mean, I suppose one thing that has struck me is a lot of things that are mass-produced nowadays, which are so ugly, be that building materials or lampposts or phone boxes or whatever. One immediate remedy for that would be to go into the factories where they're being mass-produced and just change the design to make it a beautiful design. Do you think mass-producing beautiful things is a good solution, or do you think mass production in general is something which has been harmful to crafts?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, yes, Morris, Morris and Co. Morris would have been horrified by that. I think, as would Ruskin. As you know, they wouldn't have been pleased about that. I mean, if you go to somebody like William Morris, if you go to one of his houses in Kelmscott Manor, which is in Oxfordshire, actually, one of the very famous, I think it's a set of curtains that was, I assume it must have been produced by Morris and Co. One of these very beautiful, very iconic curtains that are sort of associated with his company. They have the original set in this house, and you read about them, and actually, well, where did this come from? Well, did he draw the design up and send it off to the factory to be mass produced? No, absolutely not. I think the story was that he and his wife bought this nice fabric that they had seen whilst travelling abroad, brought it back to their home, and his wife embroidered this fabric with flowers, and they thought, well, those would make some nice curtains, and hung them up, and there they still are. Craft. It was not. Oh well, here's a beautiful. Here's a lovely design. Let's send it off to the factory to be mass produced. No. These are quite iconic now. These curtains, and ironically, they are sent off to factories to be mass produced. But that original set was simply some beautiful material brought into their home, and turned into something more beautiful by his wife, really. That's what they were. So no, it's not a solution to just mass produce beautiful things. Now, I will caveat that by saying that certainly the things that sort of need to be mass produced, so to speak, certainly could be made a lot more beautiful if a wiser eye was cast over them, and that would certainly be a great benefit. But what I'm really interested in terms of craft is not so much the kind of, well, we just need to mass produce beautiful things. It's much more about, no, we need to recover a far more personal way of making things, not only in the things that we buy, but also in our own lives as well, in what our crafts are and what we make ourselves.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I think it was Sir Roger Scruton wrote about with beauty was he was writing specifically about architecture, but this idea that if you design a beautiful building for a particular function and that function goes, people still want to have the building and use it for something else. I suppose you could make a similar point with these beautiful works of whatever craft you're doing, that these objects which have a particular function, if they're beautiful enough, even once that function disappears, people will still want to have them around.
Yes, absolutely. That's certainly true, and we can see that. We can sort of see instantiations of that in the modern day, where if you go into certain sort of modern houses, you see that certain people like to collect kind of antique artifacts and things like that, even if these are objects that are kind of well beyond their use or are no longer being used for their original kind of intended purpose. They've taken on this kind of beautiful patina of age, and they're so beautifully made in the first place that people like just to have them there, just as objects to enjoy or to use for some different purpose. So that's I can certainly see examples of that. I would say there is also something of the kind of the reverse of that, where objects that are created using the principles of craft, so by craftsmen, where they pour their personality and the skill that they've learned into them. Even if those objects are not necessarily built to be beautiful, or are not what we would traditionally imagine to be a beautiful object, they take on this kind of mysterious beauty through their use. So the example that I would give would be maybe some of the bridges that you see down in Dartmoor over the streams. So those were not built to be beautiful bridges. They were built because people needed to go from one side of the stream to the other. But they were built by craftsmen, or at least people who were having a jolly good go at it. And over time, they've taken on just this, like I say, this beautiful patina of age. I think they're called the post bridges. And now thousands of people flock to them every year to take pictures of them and to walk over them. They weren't built to be beautiful. They have no particular sort of beautiful features or anything. They're just really, they are functional, and yet because of how they've been built, the principles in sort of informing how they've been built, they have become so beautiful over time. And this applies to many other things that were not necessarily built to be beautiful, but have become so beautiful. Another example would be the old cottages of country people in the English countryside. A lot of those were built by people with very little money. They were building with whatever local materials they could find, and yet you walk through the countryside and you see a thatched cottage that's been built by craftsmen, or at least people attempting to build along the principles of craft, having a good go at it, hobbyists, if you like. and yet these things they are beautiful. They have become so beautiful over time.
Yes, and maybe there's something there to do with the materials that they use being sourced locally too, that they somehow fit into the landscape because they're just taking stones from one place and moving them to another, really.
Yes, that's true, and that's, you know, that's almost another principle that I didn't get into in my original article. But you know, if you are making, if your craft involves, if the materials of your craft are being sourced from sort of the immediate area around you, you know, it makes you a far more rooted person, because this is one of the challenges that we face in the modern day, is this kind of uprootedness, this kind of deracination. You know, people move around all the time. I think it's, you know, people who are aged 25, by the time they get to 25, they've moved on average about 10 times. I couldn't believe that when I first read it, and then I started counting up the number of times that I moved, and I think it was about 9. And you know, we're moving from place to place to place to place. Your work is digital, it's online. You know, you're not. A lot of people are just kind of uprooted from place. Whereas, you know, cultivating a craft that uses materials from your local area is one of the many ways in which you can really kind of re-root yourself.
Yes, definitely. And perhaps another benefit of this kind of localism is that the craftsmen who were building those bridges or those cottages, if they were from the adjoining village, they're going to have to live with the consequences of what they've made, and maybe that's something that can help them to build something which, even if they weren't building it in order to be beautiful, or at least building it to be pleasant to look at.
Yes, true, and of course the kind of genius loci, the kind of genius of place as well, you know, does actually have, if you're using materials from your area, you know, that has a profound effect in the kind of product, in what you produce. I mean, you can see this very clearly in another hobby of mine, which is brewing, which, you know, historically, the beer that different areas brewed was really highly variable because of differences in the water that they had access to, differences in kind of like local yeasts, differences in what the barley was like in their local area. And so you have all these kind of different styles and types and you know, flavors of beer popping up all over the place, and they're all different. You go from place to place, and they're a kind of expression of that local area. You know, it's again, it's very different in the modern day. Now in modern breweries, what we can do is we can kind of imitate the qualities of different particular places. You can adjust your water parameters to match that of the Upper Rhine Valley or whatever it is. But you know, but back then, this kind of genius of place had a real kind of profound effect in the results of the craft in that local area, in that example brewing.
Yeah, definitely. And all of these crafts that you would recommend people taking up and trying to do so in a localized way and appreciating their local area. How would you recommend someone starts off if they don't know what craft to do? They haven't had a hobby like this before. How should they get started?
Well, I think they should think about something they want or need, I would say. I think maybe some people listening to this, or some people who read my article, might be thinking, oh gosh, well, you know, I'm not particularly handy. You know, I'm very, very busy at my job. I couldn't possibly get started becoming a master furniture maker or something. And I'm not. That's not actually what I'm saying. What, you know, the basis of the kind of the idea behind cultivating a craft is really kind of more about cultivating a more productive life, or maybe a more productive household if you're married. And that could start at a very, very, very basic level. You know, I think in many households today, the most productive thing that the household does when it comes together is just cooking dinner, cooking a meal. Because what you're doing there is you're taking the raw materials and you're turning them into something better. And that really is the basis of all craft, taking the raw materials and turning them into something better. So even at its most basic level, just cooking, starting to improve your cooking, starting to use more local ingredients, start to become a bit more ambitious, start learning, start teaching yourself. It can start at this very, very basic level. Alternatively, think about something that you want or something that you need. In my own sort of life, it was with the candles. I wanted to be burning candles at home at the time, and in fact the reason that we started doing beeswax candles is because I wanted to be burning beeswax candles on at the table over dinner and such like, but I found they were a bit pricey, and so I didn't, we were struggling, didn't want to spend too much money on them, so I thought, well, let's try and make them ourselves. So I would encourage people, just think about something like that. Think about something you use, think about something you need or something you want, and think, well, could I start to make this myself, even at just a very rudimentary level, just for my own use, because then you don't need to think, there's no pressure to say, well, it has to be perfect right away. Just for your own use, think about something you want or need, and think, could that be the basis of a new craft for me or for my family?
Wonderful. And there are so many different things that we engage with in our lives, whether that's something as complicated as furniture, even just reupholstering a chair or something, working with fabric, making curtains. There are all kinds of things you can go
Absolutely.
into.
These are great examples. Do you have a chair that's looking a bit tired? Perhaps you might consider trying to reupholster it. Do you have some clothes that have holes in them that you're otherwise going to throw out? Maybe you could mend them. That's exactly the kind of principle, is to think about what you might need, and kind of go from there.
Nice, wonderful. Well, if you've enjoyed this conversation, do make sure you read William's article in the June issue from last year of Bedrock. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do. Just to reiterate, the March issue is still available until June the 15th, so do take a look in there for more articles. And to wrap up, are there any final words of advice you'd give to our listeners who might now be feeling inspired to take on a craft of their own?
Yes, just get started. Get started. That's the biggest hurdle is just to get going, I think. So don't let anything hold you back. Just give it a try. The first attempt probably won't be that good. Mine wasn't, but it will get better and better and better.
Amazing. Well, thank you for listening, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex.